Just to get the most obvious bit of background out of the way first, I've already heard a bunch of Gentle Giant. Freehand, Octopus, Power and the Glory, all among my all-time favorite albums.
Today we get to talk about one of my favorite progressive rock bands, and that's always fun. In the world of progressive rock, we have what we call the Big Five. Yes. Genesis. Emerson, Lake and Palmer. King Crimson. And number 5, that's kind of a wild card. For some folks, it's Jethro Tull.
To be thick as a brick.
For some folks, it's Pink Floyd. For me, it's Gentle Giant.
I mean, there's a lot to like about Gentle Giant, right? First of all, the dizzying breadth of styles that they can execute. I mean, this song. And this song. Are not only the same band, but the same album. Subsequent tracks even. And nobody, to my knowledge, was able to create complex songs out of simple parts better than Gentle Giant. Quite Baroque. And if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it.
Most British progressive rock groups were inspired by classical music, something that they all grew up hearing. In the case of Gentle Giant, it's almost the Baroque era.
However, I have been warned by bigger fans than myself that their last album, Civilian, was their weakest. So I've avoided it until now. Looking at the track listing, the only song I know for sure is track number 4. Number 1.
If you're unfamiliar with Gentle Giant, here's a quick primer. They actually grew out of the ashes of a 60s British pop group called Simon Dupree and the Big Sound. And they had a minor hit called Kites. Progressive rock started to grow out of the cracks of the sidewalk, so to speak. And a new band formed called Gentle Giant. Their first 2 albums, the self-titled debut and the follow-up, Acquiring the Taste, definitely showed their intent right from the get-go. Followed pretty quickly by their 3rd album, which was a big jump ahead, called Three Friends. I think this is arguably their best record. At least it's my favorite. It's a conceptual record, which is the only record in their catalog that is like that. Where do you go from there, though? The answer is to get more elaborate. So on their follow-up, their 4th album, it was called Octopus. This is the American cover. It was thought up by Derek Shulman, the lead singer. I don't think anything could really rival the original cover done for England, done by progressive rock mastermind artist Roger Dean. There's a few others I'd like to mention, including The Power and the Glory, which is another favorite of mine, and I think probably their best later record. Although many would argue that In a Glass House is their greatest work. After that, there are 2 records that I consider to be sort of companions. The fan favorite, Freehand, is probably the one I would give a beginner. They did another album that's kind of echoes Freehand, and it's called Interview. After that, a transitional album came along called The Missing Piece that really walked the line nicely between their early progressive sound and a more stripped-down 80s approach.
But my history with Gentle Giant's music is only part of the backstory this week. See, when I was a kid, I'd visit my dad in Tallahassee over summers, and from the time I was 12 until after I graduated high school, there was no Allman Brothers Band. So, Dad was always home, working at a stereo shop, watching the Braves on TBS, mowing the grass on the weekends. If there were perks to the fact that he was a musician, well, he was a great source for music I hadn't heard before. Plus, he could occasionally get me concert tickets. My friend Roger and I got to meet Robert Plant. after show on the Now and Zen tour, thanks to Dad. But one thing I distinctly remember during some of those years visiting him over summers is him on the phone talking heatedly about Allman Brothers or other music type business matters. Holes in the production you could drive a truck through. Heard him say that a lot. And to get to our next point, you're going to need a little bit of history. The record label that originally signed the Allman Brothers, Capricorn, had gone bankrupt in 1980. And while after that bankruptcy, the next two albums were released by Arista Records, it was Polydor who purchased the Allman Brothers' back catalog in 1985. And this is where Gentle Giant comes in. Because at the time, the head of Polydor was Derek Shulman, the world's foremost Shulberry virtuoso.
Derek's job was to sign new hot talent. And one of the first groups he signed was a group from New Jersey called Bon Jovi. Other groups he signed included Cinderella, Dream Theater, Pantera, who basically redefined heavy metal for the next 10 years.
I never actually talked to Dad about what he thought about being in a professional partnership with Polydor, but I do know that in 2008, the Allman Brothers sued Universal Music Group. See, Universal purchased Polydor along with the rest of Polygram's labels, and the Allman Brothers were suing for back royalties. But this is all stuff I put together after the fact. See, Butch didn't really like talking business when he didn't have to, so I never really asked him. When I do these videos, though, I often wonder what Dad might think. And this week, I think his input would likely be more professional than artistic. And that's kind of interesting. Well, to me, anyway. Okay, it's not that Civilian's bad. It's just so straight. This music is largely riff-heavy, straight-ahead rock. There's not a lot of evidence of the inventive songwriting and arranging that I typically think of when I think of Gentle Giant. Honestly, I think I hear more similarities to like Montrose or Thin Lizzy. Yeah, even Wikipedia lists the genre as hard rock, not progressive or experimental like their other albums.
There was no 80s makeover a la Genesis or Yes. And you could tell that they were trying to adapt to the times, but I think the fact that they were so obscure didn't help matters. Like a band like Yes was already well known, so when they re-emerged in the early 80s, it's like, oh, I remember those guys. Gentle Giant wasn't like that. So this 80s commercial makeover, stripping down of their sound to a pure rock kind of riffage. You know, it was the right move. I understand it, but obviously the world didn't pay much attention.
And if we look at the tunes in that same sort of straight-ahead rock context, there's actually some relatively cool moments on this album. The riff used in the chorus of All Through the Night, for example. Catchy. Nicely syncopated. Good hook. And the little ascending runs used to connect the chords in the chorus of Number One. This is exactly the kind of thing I would have written for that part. Dig it. Am I a Camera? Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad song. No, not a bad song necessarily, but I will say that I think it might be my least favorite song in the entire Gentle Giant catalog. It's the hokey little riff in the verses. Yes, it's not something I can hear for 3 minutes straight without it becoming like the little jingle in Halloween 3. You remember that? Silver Shamrock. It's Not Imagination has some standard pentatonic runs for the verses, but I do like the changes that they use in the choruses. The two songs on this album that I feel are closest to the more experimental Gentle Giant are Underground and Inside Out, harmonically anyway. Like every other song on the album, the rhythm section is pretty straight-ahead rock in both cases. Underground sounds a lot to me like they were trying to invoke the sound of Yes without actually playing a Yes song. Or maybe I'm nuts, you tell me. But when I hear this, I think immediately of Chris Squire. But Inside Out, on the other hand, my brain wouldn't let go of the fact that the sung melody hits that Lydian sharp 4 on the way up, just as the arpeggiated figure underneath it spells the 4 chord, and somehow you don't hear a massive dissonance there. So I had to pull it apart to see what's actually happening. All right, when I first sat down to learn Inside Out, I thought that it was just the first thing that we all learn about double stops. That it was sixths, right? So I thought it was A, B minor, C sharp minor, and D, but that's not it. He's not playing sixths there, he's playing fifths. So that first chord is actually an F sharp with an A in the bottom. So when you add the vocal melody on top of it, it becomes F sharp minor, G, A, and B major. Neat trick, that. The more I listened to Civilian over the week, the more I developed a kind of empathy for what I was hearing. But to walk you through how I arrived there is going to require a bit more of the backstory I talked about earlier. When the Allman Brothers broke up for the first time in 1976, it was under some pretty painful circumstances. I won't go into details here, other than to say there were some bad feelings between the band members at the time. 3 years later, when they were finally able to reconcile, they reformed without Chuck Leavell or Lamar Williams, because their Southern fusion band Sea Level was doing pretty well at the time. And when J-Mo left Sea Level to rejoin the Allman Brothers, they hired Joe English to replace him, who had just finished recording and touring with Paul McCartney and Wings. So the Allman Brothers hired Dan Toller on second guitar and David Rook Goldfleece on bass, both of whom had previously been members of Dickie Betts' band Great Southern. And Rook had also played for Ram Jam before Great Southern. Remember Black Betty? In 1979, the Allman Brothers recorded an album on Capricorn Records called Enlightened Rogues, which is a legitimately good album. It got them their first Grammy nomination for the instrumental Pegasus. But then, things started to get bad again. In quick succession, Capricorn Records went bankrupt, and then J-Mo left the band. The Allman Brothers were signed to Arista Records, and Arista immediately went to work on trying to modernize their sound. Arista hired a producer named Mike Lawler, a country session musician who had previously worked with the likes of George Jones and Gary Stewart. Then Mike ended up joining the band in 1981, on synthesizers of all things. The 2 albums that resulted, Reach for the Sky and Brothers of the Road, these are the albums that most Allman Brothers fans don't want to talk about. But I do, because despite personnel changes, the rise of disco and new wave, the demise of the only record company they had ever worked with, infighting, the pressures from their new label, disconnection from their longtime trusted producer Tom Dowd, and the comical amounts of drugs they were using, they still managed to record a few fabulous songs. I mean, have you ever heard From the Madness of the West? And here is where my brain projects a circumstantial similarity onto Civilian. Because while I don't know for sure, it seems to me that Gentle Giant might have been undergoing a similar situation at a similar time. After all, Civilian was their first release on Columbia since 1972's Octopus. So my hunch is they were being pressured to modernize as well. Or at the very least, try and get a bit more radio friendly. So what started happening as I was listening to Civilian is I was listening with the same kind of open heart I have when listening to Reach for the Sky or Brothers of the Road. So I find I have a lot more affection for Civilian as a result.
It's actually a really good record if you can just kind of forget about the ones that came previous to it and just accept it on its own merits. You know, it's a great riffy rock record with some clever playing.
Mostly. I still don't have much fun with I Am a Camera. To be clear, is this the same Gentle Giant that pulled off Knots? Or Freehand? No chance. I don't know though. I've kind of developed a soft spot for Civilian.